And if you're watching this after looking at your email, you'll know that I've had to cancel the Zoom call that was slated for tonight. So few people in the class. One of the effects is that if one or two of us can't make it, the exercise sort of becomes meaningless. Um, so what I wanted to point out is this is the last time you'll see me formally, but it won't be the last time you'll be hearing from me. So I'll have a few thoughts for you all at the end of the weekend as we wrap up the course. But one of the things I wanted to do this for right now, right, as you're spending your time engaging with the final paper, getting ready to write the final exam, or even drafting your answers for that, is to talk a little bit about the sort of view from here and not necessarily summarize all of the content that we've covered so far in the course, right? But instead to sort of go back to where we started and to think about why a course like this matters in a program like this, and what we sort of learned along the way. So I wanted to actually start a little bit and just sort of remind, because it's easy to get lost in the trees, right? For the forest, to think a little bit about, well, why there's a course like this, and a program like this, right? And that basically works from the assumption that as a great power, the US actually has the capacity to shape the international environment. So mentioned many times, I'm Canadian originally. Canada is not a great power. Canada does not have the resources um, to influence how the international system actually functions. It's what we call in international relations a middle power, right? So when you think about national security in Canada and Canadian foreign policy, it's very different, right, than what you get in a program like this, which is focused on U.S. national security. This influencing, the shaping can be substantive. We can actually use our power and the influence associated with it to set and enforce rules. We can say things like, if you want access to the global trading system, a system that uses our dollar, our banks, our international infrastructure, you have to play by our rules, right? That might be unfair. Not every state will want to do that, but we do have that capacity. The other is that this shaping can be interactional. Because we're so big and influential, we can undertake things that are designed to align countries, align allies, and either appeal to them militarily, right, to offer security guarantees, or to appeal to them in what Joseph Nye has famously called soft power terms, right? The idea that a system that we're at the center of is more conducive to your interests and your benefit than one offered by a competitor, right? So seeing this means we need to look at structural or systemic considerations, not just specific issues. And if there's one particular analytical takeaway from a program like this, it's that, right? That when we think about U.S. national security, unlike how we think about it in terms of politics in the more banal sense, who gets elected, what Congress does, so on and so forth, or the play of popular discourse, we as analysts really do need to look at how specific issues not just function, but relate to these larger goals, right? I said a little bit about this earlier in the program, but one of the things that it means is as a great power, we can provide both club and private goods to the system in order to maintain both our influence and power directly, and secondarily, to keep the conditions right for our ability to wield that power, right? So when we make decisions as a great power, our first goal has to be to manage that system and our place in it, not just how to respond to any one particular instance. Um, and that means maintaining specific kinds of linkages in order to create foundations for our use of power. So I note here the US dollar, right? Because the US dollar is the preeminent US global reserve currency, it allows us lots of different ways in which we can exercise our power. What we're going to talk about, though, is that actually requires us to make particular kinds of trade-offs um, that might not be very visible if we looked at only very specific things. So genuine strategic analysis, the kind of thing that this program is designed to help you do, is specifically tied to these wider dynamics, not just the specifics of a specific issue, right? But to think about national security in terms of shaping an environment conducive to our power and maintaining our position in such a way that we can exercise that power. So that means we have to think a lot about what it means to actually wield power. We have to understand that our power is both relational and multifaceted, right? It's relational in the sense that whether or not we actually have the power to accomplish something requires us to actually have a lever to pull something. So again, maintaining those systemic characteristics that allow us to have these levers to pull, but to understand that those levers might not always produce leverage. So not pulling a lever may not necessarily be weakness. This is sort of fodder for politicians, right? To argue about, well, we didn't do this. This is a disgrace. We are you whatever. But actually, it might be simply a concession to the fact that we could pull that lever, but it won't produce any change. And pulling that lever may have negative repercussions in another place. Um, it also means we have to think about the fact that we may have levers and leverage in a particular instance, but realizing that may come at the expense of other things, right? So we may be able to fix a problem, right? We may be able to get our way in a specific instance, but that may come at the expense of these wider systemic considerations that are so important to us in the long run. It also means that we may actually find ourselves in a world where, because we're thinking about maintaining our position in the system, we're working to maintain the best of all bad outcomes. That actually we might not live in a world where we expend huge amounts of resources to fix a particular problem because of the trade offs involved. And also, there's an often irreconcilable tension between our domestic interest and international power. Hence Baldwin's contention that this must be inherently political. It must be something that we think about and discuss politically through institutions. But what we as analysts must do is try to understand and contextualize those problems as effectively as possible, right? So, what does it mean to exercise power? It means that a sound strategy often entails unclear or unpopular trade offs that can be exploited for political points. And this is what differentiates political posturing from foreign policy analysis or analysis of national security strategy, like we're undertaking here. Because the exercise of power can do lots of different things, obviously, almost always at the same time, and in ways that may mean that we get different kinds of outcomes depending on which ones you're focusing on. So the exercise of power can be designed to lessen a negative outcome that was either unavoidable or too costly to avoid, right? We may be exercising our power in order to try to ensure that we live in a world that we satisfy in a world rather than pouring all of our resources into avoiding a particular issue. Power can also result in something negative, but which is less dangerous than an alternative. We may exercise in our power in a way that actually does create negative implications for us, but those negative implications are more preferable to us than any alternatives, either because it would take too much power, expend too much power to realize this other thing, or because we simply can't control it. We also need to understand the exercise of power can be a recognition that we simply do not want to expend the resources necessary to prevent it, that the larger systemic effects or the trade offs are unpalatable to us. There also may be instances where we have many or even seemingly far removed goals, like exercising power not to address a specific issue, but to maintain the alignment of our alliances or maintain the wider system, which means there may be lots of instances where the exercise of power is soundly wielded um, as a form of forbearance, accepting negative outcomes, accepting things that are inconsistent with our interests, under the understanding that accepting that actually benefits us in a wider, more long-term way. So I wanted to use the sanctions regime against Russia, something we talked about earlier in our term, as an example of this. And I'll be honest, I haven't sat down with pen and paper for sort of on a rock and thought all the way through all of this, right? So I don't want you to mistake this list for a complete list. But this is an example of what I'm sort of talking about, right? So the use of sanctions against Russia, whether or not they were effective, really comes to understand what it is we were trying to accomplish. And as strategic analysts, what we're actually interested in, again, is not necessarily just this one individual case, but what it means for maintaining these wider systemic considerations. So these are some possible goals and whether or not they were effective, right? And this is the kind of thinking that we need to engage if we're going to analyze national security strategy effectively. One was, well, did it prevent Russian invasion? Did it deter that? Did the threat of sanctions actually accomplish that? No, it did not, right? Ironically, I think you can make a really good argument that one of the deterrent that the deterrent effect of sanctions against Russia had already been undermined by the depth of sanctions that we'd applied to Russia. That Russia had made a decision to make itself far more insulated from the global economy or the elements of it that we controlled. And what's fascinating about that is it's an illustration of how if you don't create an environment where states still use your public and club goods, your actual ability to manipulate their behavior goes down, right? Another point would be, did it prevent expansion of the war? And that's kind of unclear right now, right? It's unclear as to what Russia's wider experience, how far they were actually would have gone had they been very successful. But there is at least some indication that our use of sanctions and various forms of economic statecraft have at least curtailed the expansion of the war. Did it signal US resolve, right? I think that that's a clear yes. It did illustrate the extent to which the United States and its allies were willing to actually suffer in order to signal resolve. We were actually willing to live through the energy crisis that's happening in Europe in order to accomplish this. I think that it did do that, which likely will shape the way states look at our actions in the near future. It could have been, did it align European allies? It very clearly accomplished that, right? Did it avoid escalation to the level of great power war? Again, this is unclear. And I want to say it's unclear because there's evidence, I think, for both sides, right? And then did it facilitate transition away from Russian energy reliance in Europe? And I think the answer to that is yes, right? So there's the proximate thing we're talking about, what to do about the war in Ukraine. And that's deeply important to US national security, right? But as analysts, we need to understand that this is not an isolated event that we can cleave off. We need to think about it in these wider and more multifaceted ways, right? So what does that mean our analytical priorities are? It means we have to ascertain how a specific issue relates to the wider strategic perspective, befitting a great power, right? And there are some negative trade-offs here, right? Are we willing to expend the resources necessary to actually see Ukraine fully successful on the battlefield? Maybe, maybe not. Um, Also, if we were to accomplish that, would it actually create a negative outcome in the fact that it would make Russia more aggressive? These kinds of considerations need to be weighed out. We need to recognize the dynamics of a response, including the alternatives and cost comparisons, right? We need to recognize that moral authority or power do not equal total control of the system, more or less because resources are finite, and we need to cultivate our influence and maintain it. Using all those resources to address one particular issue is probably not a sound long-term strategy. We may win in the short term, but we may suffer larger trade or setbacks in our larger strategic perspective. And we need to identify the wider context, not just settle the political or rhetorical scores around particular instances. And I mean political here in scare quotes because what I'm referring to is the domestic, the sort of pedestrian political sense of elections, leaders, and so on and so forth, right? Now, one of the things that's important for us as analysts then is to understand the environment. And that's one of the things that analysts in national security do. We offer prescriptive analysis or descriptive analysis, sorry. We describe the nature of the international system so that we can better understand it's the way it functions, so that we can ascertain the mechanisms we can use or create or maintain in order to wield power. So one of the key considerations here is as a great power, we must understand that even our inherently domestic considerations have implications for managing the global system. Now, I think it's just simply mature to point out that if we want to wield that power internationally and reap the massive material and political benefits, there are going to be irreconcilable trade-offs, and they should be addressed as such. What I would point out is that that's not a great idea to say out loud if you're running for office, to argue that what you're going to do is good for the US globally and internationally, but it's going to hurt sort of a certain segment of the population. But I think that there's some sense in which that is inevitable, right? And it points out to the need to think about understanding how what we might have to do to solidify our security globally will require some efforts domestically, right? This is also the call for leadership, which is a hallmark of the What's Wrong with Washington books that so many of us read all the time, and why they usually end there, right? They end with a call for the presidency or political leaders or thought leaders to try to create a world in which we can address these trade-offs, manage them, and realize our larger power so as to secure our inherent national security, right? Not security in one instance, but in general. What this means is fomenting potential power requires understanding the context of our relative capacities. For Blackwell and Harris, this comes down to the fact that we shouldn't be like autocratic powers, right? We shouldn't just say, but we also shouldn't cede the field. It means being deliberate in either determining, countering, or managing their power, and realizing that that is a conversation best understood in systemic terms, not necessarily individual terms, and that in individual cases we may have to exercise forbearance, we may have to accept trade-offs, we may actually have to prioritize and give up things that we would otherwise really not like to see go a particular way in order to realize these larger goals. And this is an analytical point, one that we can subject to theoretical empirical critique, right? And that's our job. Now, what about the environment? Well, I think we've actually had some really fascinating conversations about it over the last few weeks, so I don't really feel the need to get deep into the weeds of the discussion. But I think what makes engaging with the environment in a course like this really interesting is that it does relate to two wider themes in the course and themes that run through the program. One is that we must contextualize things in the international politics, and that the words and ways of thinking and techniques that we associate with that contextualization matter because they will lead us to think about the resulting priority in very particular kinds of ways. Another way of saying this is that when we contextualize something, we don't start from scratch, right? Instead, we reach for ways of thinking and associations we already have in hand, and that will deeply shape how we think about this new thing. Um, and it's important to note that these pre-existing ways of thinking feel very rational and reflective to us because we actually take them for granted, right? Um, I'd also note that when it comes to national security, the fact that we are dealing with threats tends to exaggerate this, right? Because we're dealing with things that could cost us huge amounts of money, could lead to loss of life, or compromise our ability to maintain our way of life. It tends to make us more intolerant of risk, unaccepting of debate, and more forceful in our assertions. It's true of every group of people, by the way, not just the United States, right? So it means that we need to think about this, which means when we're engaging with the environment, what we get is the idea of climate change can be a very powerful organizing effect, right? It can drive us to respond to things in ways that we might not have in the past, and that could be a good thing. But this can come at the expense, if we're not careful, of other, perhaps more important considerations. I think Syria's civil war is an example of this, right? Our work on there illustrates that we did come to a conclusion that climate change does matter to US national security, but we need to be careful about how widely we use that frame because it can drown out other more important considerations, right? So this was the point about how it didn't seem like there was a whole lot of evidence to suggest that the Syrian civil war was caused by climate change, right? Instead, it seemed more um, specifically related to the dynamics of that autocratic regime, its erosion, and its haphazard transition to a liberal system. Now, what's important about this is because the Syrian civil war is deeply important to our national interest because it's what drives a large part of the migrant crisis um, into Europe. It has the potential, or did for a long period of time, to destabilize the region. It influences our ability to align our alliances, namely NATO, because Turkey, which borders Syria, is a NATO member. So this is something that matters to our national security. We have to understand how that conflict works in order to manage it appropriately. It also means that generalization can compromise our understanding, and it can lead us to think about the world in very particular ways, and then lead us along a path that may or may not equip us to deal with the kinds of effects that we're likely to see. So the weaponization of water, as an example, is highly likely. But wars over water between stable nation states is very much not, right? There's little reason to think that states involved in the international system who are otherwise stable and have a good amount of state capacity are unlikely to fight wars with each other over water. So again, I said a little earlier, it's unlikely the United States is going to have to defend its water um, from Canada, nor which is probably the nearest source of large amounts of fresh water, right? Um, Nor is Canada likely actually going to put itself in an environment where it would have to fight a war with the United States over them. Instead, we will create likely trade relationships, institutional arrangements, which will make that possible. But that doesn't mean that increasingly scarce water won't matter. It will matter because in certain instances, like in places where that state capacity doesn't exist, like states where there is ongoing civil war and non-state actors are able to target that infrastructure, it will be incredibly important, right? So looking at regional dynamics and the nature of different kinds of war, which are both covered by other parts of the program, matter here, right? When we're thinking about this, we're thinking about contextualizing the frame and making sure we're elaborating ways of understanding it and addressing it that are well suited to the problem. I don't think you have to take securitization and critical theories of international security all the way down here. You don't necessarily have to get to a point where you agree with something like the Copenhagen School, which argues that threats don't have an inherent set of characteristics. Instead, they're just a group of things that we as a society have decided to group together under the argument that there are lots of things equally as dangerous to us, but we don't treat them all the same. I don't think you have to go all the way down there, but I think at least what it illustrates to you is that you need to think reflexively about the way we think about security, right? If you evoke security, if you evoke national security, you create these dynamics that I said earlier, right? You're creating an environment where we tend to become intolerant of risk, unaccepting of debate, and forceful in our assertions. Now, that can be good if our response is well calibrated, but we need to make sure of that. We can't just simply accept that it already is because we feel strongly about it. And by we here, I do mean analysts, politicians, and the general public, right? So, in some sense, this is what I wanted to accomplish, right? Was to illustrate how I think what this course does, while it does expose you um, to some very specific important substance, what it really does is drive the wider analytical goals of the program. You'll also start to see that this is exactly the kind of thing that I'm looking for you to be able to do in your final exam and your paper. And one of the things, hopefully, as you move through the program, becomes easier and easier for you to do. Given that most of you are getting to the end of the program, that's definitely visible in some of your discussion posts. So I hope you have a wonderful evening or rest of the day, depending on when you're watching this. I'm very much looking forward to the rest of the course, the remainder of it, and I look forward to hearing all of your perspectives and the various assignments that you're working on over this week.